In the rain-soaked shadows of Somerton Court, a grand English estate, a bitter family gathers under the iron rule of Lord Alastair Finch. When the old patriarch announces a shocking new will, stripping his heir of a fortune and handing it to his young wife, Eleanor, tensions ignite. That night, a scream pierces the silence. Lord Alastair is dead, a tiny puncture mark on his hand revealing a chilling truth. This was no heart attack, but murder by a rare snake venom. Who wielded the cunning weapon, hidden in plain sight? Was it the desperate son, the scheming daughter-in-law, the loyal widow, or the silent guardian of a forgotten past? As Hercule Poirot steps into this nest of lies, one question burns. In a house full of secrets, who is the true serpent? Chapter 1. The Setup. The rain that fell on Somerton Court that October evening was a particularly English sort of rain, a fine, persistent drizzle that was less a downpour and more a liquid manifestation of melancholy. It clung to the ancient stones of the house, slicked the gravel of the winding drive, and blurred the outlines of the great skeletal oaks that stood sentinel on the lawns. Inside, the atmosphere was no less oppressive, though a great fire roared in the dining hall's cavernous hearth, its flames casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock the rigid formality of the assembled party. At the head of the long, polished mahogany table sat Lord Alastair Finch, the master of the house. At 78, he was a relic of a bygone era, his body frail and shrunken within his impeccably tailored dinner jacket, but his eyes, nested in a web of deep wrinkles, had lost none of their hawk-like intensity. They moved now with a slow, deliberate cruelty, surveying the family gathered before him as a king might survey a court of vipers. His breath came in shallow, wheezing gasps, a constant reminder of the heart condition that kept him a prisoner in his own home. And yet, no one at the table was foolish enough to mistake his physical weakness for a softening of his will. To his right sat his wife, Eleanor. She was his second, a fact the portraits of the stern-faced Finch ancestors lining the walls never seemed to let her forget. At 32, she possessed a serene, almost ethereal beauty that seemed entirely out of place in the gloomy magnificence of Somerton Court. Her gown was a simple column of deep emerald silk. Her only adornment was a single strand of pearls at her throat, the famous Finch pearls, a wedding gift that had caused a scandal in itself. She ate with a quiet, graceful composure, her expression a mask of gentle solicitude as she occasionally turned to her husband. "Are you quite comfortable, my dear? The draught from that window can be so treacherous." Lord Alastair merely grunted, a sound of dismissal that made his son, Julian, flinch across the table. Julian Finch, the heir apparent, was a man in his late 40s who wore his disappointment like a poorly fitting suit. His face was florid, his shoulders slumped with the perpetual weight of his father's disapproval and his own mounting debts. He clutched his wine-glass with white-knuckled intensity, his gaze fixed on the dregs of claret as if they held the answers to his ruin. Beside him, his wife Penelope was a study in tense ambition. Her fingers, adorned with rings that were perhaps a touch too ostentatious, tapped a restless rhythm against the starched linen of the tablecloth. She watched Eleanor with a look of undisguised resentment, her mind a frantic abacus, calculating every glance, every soft word from her father-in-law's young wife, and converting it into a potential loss against her husband's inheritance.
The final two guests at the table were, in their own ways, as much a part of the house's fabric as the damp rot in the library. Dr. Arbuthnot, the local physician, was a quiet, unassuming man in his 50s, his tweed jacket smelling faintly of antiseptic and pipe tobacco. He had tended to the Finches for 2 decades, a silent repository of the family's physical and, one suspected, emotional ailments. His presence was a constant, sober reminder of the patriarch's mortality. He observed the proceedings over the rim of his spectacles with a professional detachment that was, if one looked closely, tinged with a deep and weary sadness. And then there was Mrs. Thorne. Elspeth Thorne had been the companion to the first Lady Finch, and, upon her employer's death 10 years prior, had simply refused to leave. She was a woman made of whalebone and righteous indignation, her gray hair pulled into a severe bun, her black bombazine dress a permanent state of mourning. She saw herself as the guardian of the family's legacy, a legacy she believed was being systematically dismantled by the upstart who now sat in her late mistress's chair. Her loyalty was to the memory of the past, and her disapproval of the present was a palpable force in the room. The meal progressed with the stilted, painful slowness of a state funeral. The clinking of silver against porcelain was unnervingly loud in the long silences. The servants, led by the ancient and almost spectral butler Jennings, moved with practiced invisibility, their faces impassive. It was Lord Alistair who finally shattered the fragile peace. He pushed his barely touched plate of roasted game away from him and placed his garned hands flat on the table. The wheezing in his chest seemed to deepen. "I have asked you all here tonight for a purpose. It has come to my attention that my affairs require clarification." Julian looked up, a flicker of desperate hope in his eyes. Penelope sat up bolt upright, her tapping fingers finally still. "As you know," Lord Alistair continued, his eyes sweeping over them all before settling with a look of something approaching tenderness on Eleanor, "my health is a precarious thing. A man in my position must ensure his legacy is protected, that it falls into the right hands." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Dr. Arbuthnot shifted uncomfortably. Miss Thorne's lips thinned into a razor-straight line. "Somerton Court and the Finch fortune have been in this family for 400 years, the old man said, with a note of pride hardening his voice. "It has survived wars, recessions, and fools." He shot a venomous glance directly at his son. "Your control, under control." Lord Alistair gave a dry, rattling laugh that ended in a hacking cough. Eleanor was instantly at his side, a glass of water in her hand. He waved her away impatiently. "Your creditors have been writing to me for months. You are a leech, a disgrace to the name." "Sir!" Penelope interjected, her voice sharp. "Julian has been under immense strain. He has been under the immense strain of his own incompetence, which is why I have made new arrangements." This was it. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, charged with anticipation. "I have, this past week, drawn up a new will. My lawyers have ratified it. It is final." He took a slow, deliberate sip of water, his eyes glittering with malicious enjoyment. He was the puppet master, and he was making them all dance. "The estate, the title, the house, those are entailed. They will pass to Julian as the law demands. I am, unfortunately, powerless to prevent that." He said the words as if admitting a great personal failure. "However, the entirety of my liquid assets, my portfolio of investments, and my collection of art which, as you know, constitutes the bulk of the Finch fortune, will be placed into a charitable trust. A collective sharp intake of breath was the only sound. Julian stared, dumbfounded, his mouth slightly agape. Lord Alistair delivered the final devastating blow. The sole executor and director of this trust, with a handsome stipend for her duties, will be my dear wife, Eleanor. The silence that followed was no longer merely oppressive, it was absolute, profound, and ringing with shock. As if the old man had pulled the pin from a grenade and placed it in the center of the table. Eleanor herself looked stunned. Her face, usually so composed, was pale, her eyes wide. "Alistair, I never discussed this. I don't know the first thing about managing such a thing." "You will learn," he said, patting her hand with a claw-like grip. "You have a good head on your shoulders, you are loyal, you understand duty, unlike some." Miss Thorne made a small choked sound, a gasp of pure outrage. "To her, a woman who has known you for barely 3 years, to give away what belongs to the Finch bloodline?" "The Finch bloodline," Lord Alistair sneered, "is currently sitting opposite me, sweating with greed and panic. I trust Eleanor to preserve what I have built. I do not trust him." Julian finally found his voice. It was a strangled whisper. "You cannot be serious. This is everything. It is my money, to do with as I please, and I have pleased to ensure it is not thrown away at the card table or on some foolish scheme. You will have the house to live in, and the pittance the land provides. You will learn to be frugal. It might build some character in you." Penelope stood up so abruptly her chair scraped back with a jarring screech. "This is monstrous! She has manipulated you!
Chapter 2. The Crime. The sound of the shattering glass acted as a starter's pistol, releasing the room's occupants from their frozen tableau. The spell of Lord Alistair's tyrannical presence was broken, replaced by a cacophony of raw, unvarnished emotion. "How could he?" Julian snarled, his face contorted in a mask of impotent rage. He paced before the fireplace, crunching shards of crystal under his heel. "To give it all away! To her! After everything I've done for this family, for this estate!" "What you've done, my dear," Penelope said, her voice dripping with acid, "is run us into the ground. This is as much your fault as anyone's. You gave him the excuse he needed." "My fault?" Julian rounded on her. "I seem to recall you being the one who insisted on redecorating the London flat, who needed a new motor car every year. And I suppose your little trips to the Newmarket races were for the good of the estate's soul," she shot back, her eyes blazing. While the Finches tore into one another, Miss Thorne rose from her seat, her posture as rigid as a church spire. She directed her venom not at them, but at the still-seated Eleanor. "You should be ashamed," she hissed, her voice low and trembling with fury. "The first Lady Finch would turn in her grave. You are a viper, madam, a serpent he has welcomed into his bosom, and now you have poisoned him against his own." Eleanor, who had been staring at the door through which her husband had departed, finally looked up. Her face was ashen, her eyes filled with a genuine, bewildered pain. "I did nothing," she whispered. "I asked for none of this, I swear it." "Your sort never has to ask," Miss Thorne spat, before turning on her heel and marching from the room, her back ramrod straight. Dr. Arbuthnot, who had been quietly packing his medical bag, cleared his throat. It sounded surprisingly effective, cutting through the escalating argument between Julian and Penelope. "If I may," he said, his tone mild but firm, "Lord Alistair is in a fragile state. This level of emotional intensity will do him no good. It would be wise for everyone to retire and allow the house to quieten down." He looked pointedly at Julian. He is your father, after all. His health must be the primary concern." The doctor's words, intended to soothe, only seemed to stoke Julian's fury further. "His health? He has just signed my death warrant, and you're worried about his health?" But the fight had gone out of him, replaced by a leaden despair. He slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. Penelope stood over him, her expression a mixture of contempt and calculation, before she too swept from the room without another word. Left alone with the defeated heir and the shell-shocked widow, Dr. Arbuthnot sighed. "Lady Finch," he said gently to Eleanor, "perhaps a glass of warm milk, a sedative even. It has been a terrible shock for you." Eleanor shook her head, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as if a sudden chill had entered the room. "Thank you, doctor, but no. I think I should just go to my room. I need to think." She rose and with a small, lost glance at her stepson, drifted out of the dining hall like a ghost. The doctor watched her go, then turned his attention back to Julian. "I will look in on your father before I depart," he said, "just to ensure he has settled." Julian didn't look up. "Do what you will," he mumbled into his hands. "It hardly matters now." The house fell into a strained and watchful silence. The rain continued its ceaseless patter against the window panes. In their respective rooms, the inhabitants of Somerton Court were left alone with their thoughts. Penelope, in her dressing cone, sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection as if trying to see a future that had just been violently rewritten. Julian had gone straight to the decanter of brandy in their sitting room. Miss Thorne could be heard pacing relentlessly back and forth in her chambers, the floorboards creaking under the weight of her indignation. And Eleanor lay on her bed, fully dressed, staring at the canopy above, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and an unwelcome, terrifying sense of power. An hour passed, then another. The grandfather clock in the main hall chimed 11, its deep, resonant bongs echoing through the cavernous spaces. It was Eleanor who broke the vigil. She could not rest. A gnawing anxiety had taken hold of her. Alistair had looked so terribly pale when he'd left the room, his breathing so alarmingly shallow. He had said not to disturb him, but he was her husband. It was her duty to care for him. The doctor had said he would check on him, but had he? He hadn't heard him leave. Slipping out of her room, she padded silently down the long, portrait-lined corridor. The house was dark, save for a single lamp left burning in the hall below. The only sound was the ticking of the clock and the drumming of the rain. The door to her husband's study was at the end of the west wing, a heavy oak door that was almost always kept locked. Tonight, it was slightly ajar. A sliver of golden light spilled out onto the dark Persian runner. Pushing the door gently, she peered inside. "Alistair?" she whispered. "My dear, are you all right?" The study was just as he had left it every night for the past 50 years. Bookshelves groaned under the weight of leather-bound volumes. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and his favorite cigar tobacco. A fire crackled softly in the grate, and a single green-shaded lamp on the massive desk cast an intimate pool of light over its surface. Lord Alistair was sitting in his high-backed leather chair with his back to the door. He was facing the desk, his head slumped forward onto his chest. A half-empty glass of brandy stood at his elbow, next to a small open bottle of clear liquid and a silver letter opener. "Alistair," she said again, a little louder, stepping into the room, "Dr. Arbuthnot said you should rest." There was no response. The silence was suddenly profound, unnatural. The ticking of the mantel clock on the fireplace seemed to grow louder, each tick a hammer blow against the stillness. A cold dread began to creep up her spine. She walked slowly around the desk, her silk slippers making no sound on the thick carpet. "My dear."
She reached his side and looked down. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the polished surface of the desk. His skin had a waxy gray pallor. His hand, which had been resting on an open ledger, had slipped off, his fingers curled slightly as if reaching for something. The glass of brandy was untouched since he had poured it. But the small bottle beside it, the bottle of digitalis, his heart medication, the one Dr. Arbuthnot had prescribed, was almost empty. An overdose. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a scream. For a moment she was paralyzed by shock. His heart, the argument, the strain had been too much for him. He had taken his medicine, but in his agitated state he must have taken too much. A tragic, fatal mistake. She reached out a trembling hand to touch his shoulder to confirm the awful, unbelievable truth. And that is when she saw it. It was not the empty bottle, nor the vacant stare in her husband's eyes. It was something small, something that did not belong. On the back of his gnarled, liver-spotted hand, just below the knuckle of his index finger, was a tiny, almost invisible mark, a minuscule puncture so small it could have been a splinter. But around it, the skin was beginning to show a faint, angry-looking discoloration. Her mind, trained by years as a nurse, recoiled from the obvious conclusion of a heart attack. That was not the sign of a man who had succumbed to a failing heart. It was the sign of something else entirely, something swift, something deliberate, something venomous. The scream that had caught in her throat now escaped a high, piercing shriek of pure terror that shattered the oppressive silence of Somerton Court and announced that the evening's drama had not ended, but had only just begun.
Chapter 3. The Arrival. Eleanor's scream tore through the house like a physical thing, a blade of sound that sliced through the layers of resentment and silence. It was followed moments later by the sound of running feet on the polished floorboards of the corridor and the frantic, disembodied shouting of voices. Julian was the first to arrive, his face pale and drawn, the smell of brandy sharp on his breath. He stopped short in the doorway, his eyes taking in the scene. His father slumped in the chair, the lamplight casting his face in a ghastly, lifeless sheen. His stepmother, white as a sheet, pointing a trembling finger at the body. "What is it? What's happened?" Julian stammered, his earlier rage forgotten, replaced by a primal, childish fear. Penelope appeared behind him, clutching a silk dressing gown at her throat. Her sharp eyes missed nothing. She saw the empty bottle of digitalis on the desk and drew a swift, practical conclusion. His heart, the argument, it was too much for him. Dr. Arbuthnot, who had been preparing to take his leave, came bustling in, his medical bag still in hand. He had been delayed by a final quiet word with Jennings about the state of the wine cellar, a conversation that had, in retrospect, saved a crucial amount of time. He pushed past the stunned couple and went straight to his patient. One look at the waxy skin, one touch to the cold wrist was all he needed. "He's gone," the doctor said, his voice heavy with a weary finality. He straightened up, his professional mask firmly in place. "I warned him. I told him any great shock could be fatal. The scene at dinner." He let the sentence hang, an unspoken accusation. Then he noticed the nearly empty bottle of medication. And this, dear God, in his distress he must have become confused, taken far too much. It was the most logical, the most obvious conclusion. A weak heart, a violent argument, a fatal miscalculation with his medicine. It was a tragedy, but a simple one. "No," a voice said, cutting through the doctor's pronouncement. It was Eleanor. She had backed away from the desk and was now standing by the fireplace, her arms wrapped around herself. Her shock had subsided, replaced by a strange cold certainty. "It wasn't his heart. Not like that."
All eyes turned to her. "My dear lady," Dr. Arbuthnot said, his tone gentle, placating, "you have had a terrible shock. It is perfectly natural to be—" "Look at his hand," she insisted, her voice gaining strength. "The back of his right hand." Puzzled, the doctor leaned back over the body. He picked up Lord Alistair's limp hand, turning it over in the lamplight. At first he saw nothing but the wrinkled, liver-spotted skin of an old man. "I don't see—" "There," Eleanor urged, stepping forward. "It's very small." Dr. Arbuthnot squinted, adjusting his spectacles, and then he saw it, a tiny red dot, no bigger than a pinprick, with the faintest hint of bruising beginning to blossom around it. He probed it gently with his thumb. It was a definite puncture. He had seen countless such marks in his time, but usually from a hypodermic needle. "How very strange," he murmured, more to himself than to anyone else. "A splinter, perhaps." "It is not a splinter," Eleanor stated, her nurse's training overriding her grief. "There is discoloration, a localized reaction. That is not from a heart attack, doctor, and it is not from an overdose of digitalis. That is the mark of an injection, or a sting." A thick, uncomfortable silence descended on the room. The implications of her words began to dawn on them. Julian stared at his father's body with a new, horrified expression. Penelope's eyes darted from Eleanor to the doctor, her mind racing. Dr. Arbuthnot straightened up slowly, his face grim. He was a man of science, a man who believed in evidence. And here was a piece of evidence that did not fit. It was small, almost insignificant, but it was there, and it contradicted everything. "Jennings," the doctor said, turning to the butler who now hovered anxiously in the doorway. "Telephone the police, at once." 2 days later, I found myself in a Daimler, speeding through the damp, leaf-strewn lanes of the English countryside. The summons had come via a rather frantic telephone call to our London flat from a physician of my acquaintance, who in turn had been contacted by a colleague in the country, the aforementioned Dr. Arbuthnot. The details were sparse, but compelling. A wealthy lord dead in his study, a family full of motives, and a single inexplicable clue that had stalled the local investigation. "It is the sort of affair that appeals, is it not, Hastings?" my companion said, breaking a long silence. He was, of course, Hercule Poirot. He sat opposite me, a picture of meticulous neatness. Not a single speck of dust dared to mar his perfectly tailored suit, and his famous mustaches were waxed to impeccable points. He gazed out at the window, not at the scenery, which he considered damp and disorderly, but at his own reflection. "A lord dying of a heart attack doesn't sound much like your sort of thing, Poirot," I confessed. "Ah, but you see, mon ami, the good doctor does not believe it was a heart attack, nor does the local constabulary now that they have looked more closely. They are baffled, and when the police are baffled, they call for an expert. It is the natural order of things." He preened slightly. "They are fortunate I was not engaged in a matter of more international significance." I suppressed a smile. Poirot's ego was as much a part of him as his little gray cells. "And this mark on the hand, what do you make of it?" "I make nothing of it, Hastings, for I have not yet seen it. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has all the evidence. You, with your romantic imagination, you build up the great castles of conjecture on the foundations of sand. Me, I require the bedrock of fact. Method, order, and the psychology. That is all that is needed." Our arrival at Somerton Court was as gloomy as the weather. The house loomed out of the mist, a vast gray pile of stone that seemed to absorb the light from the sky. A police constable, looking thoroughly miserable, stood at the door and directed us to the library where the family had been gathered. The atmosphere inside was thick with suspicion and barely concealed animosity. A local detective, an Inspector Davies, was attempting to maintain a semblance of order.
He was a large, stolid-looking man whose expression of weary frustration deepened at the sight of Poirot's immaculate foreign appearance. Dr. Arbuthnot detached himself from the group and came forward to greet us. "Monsieur Poirot, it is a great relief that you could come. I am Dr. Arbuthnot." "Enchanté," he said with a small bow. He surveyed the room, his green eyes moving from face to face, bright and intelligent as a cat's. I followed his gaze, taking in the cast of characters. Julian Finch, looking haggard and nursing a drink. His wife Penelope, composed and watchful. The elderly companion, Miss Thorne, sitting upright in a wing-back chair, radiating disapproval. And finally, the widow, Lady Finch, a figure of quiet, pale grief that seemed to shrink under the collective gaze of the others. "The situation is delicate," Dr. Arbuthnot murmured, leading us to one side. "Inspector Davies is a good man, but he is at a loss. The post-mortem was inconclusive. They found the digitalis in Lord Alistair's system, certainly, enough to have been fatal. But the toxicologist also found something else, a trace amount of a highly unusual, fast-acting neurotoxin of reptilian origin." "Reptilian?" I exclaimed. "Precisely," the doctor confirmed. "Snake venom. To be specific, the venom of the boomslang, a creature native to sub-Saharan Africa." Poirot's eyebrows shot up. "Intriguing. And this venom was introduced via the puncture on the hand?" "That is the theory. A tiny amount, delivered by a needle of some sort, perhaps. It would have been almost instantaneously fatal, precipitating a massive cardiac arrest. To the casual observer, it would look identical to the heart attack he was always expected to have. The digitalis overdose was, we believe, a piece of misdirection, a red herring, as they say." "A very clever red herring," he mused, his eyes sweeping once again over the silent figures in the room. He straightened his tie and took a step towards the center of the room, commanding the attention of everyone present. "My name is Hercule Poirot," he announced, his voice clear and precise. "I have been asked to assist the police in the matter of the death of Lord Alistair Finch." He paused, letting his gaze rest for a moment on each of them. It was not a threatening look, but it was intensely penetrating. It was the look of a man who did not see titles or family ties, but saw only the intricate, dark workings of the human soul. "A man is dead," he continued softly, "and it is my business to discover the truth. Here, in this house, there is evil, and I, Hercule Poirot, will find it." The fire crackled in the grate. Outside, the...
Chapter 4. The Questions Begin. Poirot's dramatic pronouncement was met with a stony silence. Inspector Davies, who clearly did not appreciate having his authority so theatrically usurped, cleared his throat with a sound like grinding gravel. "Yes, well, thank you, Mr. Poirot. As I was saying, our inquiries are ongoing. We are asking for everyone's full cooperation." Poirot turned to the inspector and gave him a smile of such dazzling, innocent charm that it seemed to momentarily disarm the larger man. "But of course, Inspector, we shall cooperate, you and I, to the fullest. 2 heads, they are better than 1, no? And my head," he added, tapping his egg-shaped skull with the forefinger, "is not an inconsiderable one. We shall proceed with method and order. First, I must see the scene of the crime. The study, if you please." Davies hesitated, then gave a reluctant nod. The study had been sealed, but he gave instructions to the constable at the door to allow us entry. As we walked, Poirot moved with a light, almost cat-like tread, his head tilted to one side as if he were listening to the very walls of the house. I, of course, followed close behind, my notebook at the ready. The study was exactly as it had been on the night of the murder,
a room frozen in time. The air was still and heavy. The fire had long since died, leaving a mound of gray ash in the hearth. The green-shaded lamp still stood on the desk, though unlit now, and a fine layer of fingerprinting powder dusted many of the surfaces. Poirot did not rush. He stood in the doorway for a full minute, his eyes scanning every detail, from the pattern on the carpet to the titles of the books on the shelves. He was not merely looking, he was absorbing the room, understanding its character, its soul. "The body, it was here?" he asked, pointing to the high-backed leather chair. "That's right," the inspector confirmed, slumped forward over the desk. Poirot approached the desk, his hands clasped behind his back. He peered at the objects on its surface, the brandy glass, the now corked bottle of digitalis, the silver letter opener, and the open ledger. He did not touch anything, but his eyes missed nothing. He noted the level of the brandy in the glass, the position of the pen beside the ledger, the faint scent of cigar smoke that still clung to the leather of the chair. "You have examined these objects, Inspector." "Thoroughly," Davies grunted. "No prints on the bottle other than the deceased's. Same for the glass. Wiped clean, we suspect. Then the old man's hand was placed around it after he was dead to make it look like he'd been drinking." "Ah," Poirot said softly. "The mind of the killer, it begins to reveal itself. He is meticulous. He is careful, but he is also, perhaps, a little too clever." He then turned his attention to the chair itself. He walked around it, examining it from every angle. He bent down, his nose almost touching the floor, to inspect the legs. He ran a gloved finger along the polished wood of the armrests. Finally, he straightened up, a peculiar expression on his face. "There is nothing here," he announced. I must have looked crestfallen, for he shot me a quick, amused glance. "That is to say, Hastings, there is nothing physical. The police, they have done their work. They have looked for the clues that you can see and touch. But the most important clues, my friend, are the ones you cannot see. They are the clues of psychology, the inconsistencies of human nature." He turned back to the inspector. "I wish to speak with the members of the household, one by one, in a room that is neutral, the morning room perhaps. And I shall begin, if you permit, with the lady who discovered the body, Lady Finch." The inspector sighed, though still looking rather put out. He could hardly refuse it. It was, after all, a perfectly logical place to start. 15 minutes later, we were seated in the morning room, a space that, despite its name, felt chilly and unwelcoming in the gray afternoon light. Poirot had positioned his chair so that the light from the tall windows fell directly upon the face of the person he was interviewing. Eleanor Finch entered the room silently. She was dressed in a simple black dress, her face pale and her eyes shadowed with grief and exhaustion. She looked fragile, a delicate piece of porcelain in a house of stone. But as she sat down, I noted the firmness of her chin, the steady composure of her hands folded in her lap. There was a core of strength in this woman that was not immediately apparent. Poirot began, his voice gentle, almost hypnotic. "Lady Finch, I know this is a time of great pain for you. I ask you to be brave. The truth, it is a harsh light, but it is the only thing that will dispel the shadows in this house. You must help me to find it." She nodded, her eyes fixed on his. "I will do whatever I can, Monsieur Poirot." "Excellent. Then I ask you to recount for me the events of that evening. Everything you remember, from the dimmer onwards. Do not omit any detail, no matter how small or insignificant it may seem to you." Eleanor took a deep breath and began to speak. Her voice was low but clear. She recounted the dreadful dinner, her husband's shocking announcement about the will, and the furious reactions of Julian and Penelope. She described Miss Thorne's bitter accusations and Dr. Arbuthnot's attempts to calm the situation. Her account was factual, precise, and devoid of overt emotion, the testimony of a trained nurse. "And after you all left the dining hall," Poirot prompted, "I went to my room. I was deeply unsettled, not just by the anger, but by Alistair's decision. He had never spoken of it to me. To place such a burden on my shoulders without any warning." She trailed off, a flicker of what looked like genuine bewilderment in her eyes. "You did not, then, desire this responsibility?" "Desire it?" She gave a short, humorless laugh. "Monsieur Poirot, I married Alistair for companionship. I was his nurse after his first wife passed away. We grew fond of one another. I knew he was an old man. I knew he was a wealthy man. But I never imagined this. I have no head for business. The others, they think I manipulated him. But I did not. I would have been content with a simple widow's pension." Poirot watched her, his head tilted. "Continue, madame." "You were in your room." "Yes, for perhaps 2 hours. I tried to read, but I couldn't concentrate. I kept thinking of Alistair. He had looked so frail, so agitated. He had forbidden anyone to disturb him, but I grew worried. I decided to check on him, just to be sure he had taken his medicine and was resting." "What time was this?" "The clock in the hall had just struck 11 as I left my room." "And you went to the study. The door, it was ajar." "Yes, just slightly. The light was on. I called his name, but there was no answer, so I went in." She described finding him, her initial belief that it was a heart attack or an overdose, and then the chilling discovery of the tiny mark on his hand. Throughout her telling, her voice remained steady, but her hands were now twisting a small lace handkerchief into a tight knot. "You have the eye of a trained observer, Lady Finch," Poirot said approvingly. "Another might never have noticed such a small detail." "It was out of place," she said simply. "Everything else in the room was exactly as it should be, but that mark, it was wrong." "Tell me, madame," Poirot said, leaning forward slightly. "Your husband, did he have enemies?" Eleanor hesitated. "My husband was a difficult man. He was an autocrat. He did not make friends easily. He demanded loyalty, but he rarely gave it in return. I suppose many people disliked him, but an enemy who would do this, I cannot imagine it. And the people in this house, on that night?" Her composure finally cracked. A single tear traced a path down her pale cheek. "They were his family," she whispered. "Julian was his son. Yes, they fought. Yes, Julian was a disappointment to him, but to kill him. And Penelope, she is ambitious, I know, but murder. And Miss Thorne." A shadow passed over her face. "Miss Thorne has never approved of me. She adored the first Lady Finch. In her eyes, I will always be an interloper. She believes I am responsible for destroying the family. She hates me." "But did she hate Lord Alistair?" "No," Eleanor said, shaking her head. "He was devoted to him in his way. He saw him as the—"
Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. "Next," Poirot said, turning to Inspector Davies with a polite but firm inclination of his head, "I will speak with Mr. Julian Finch." If Eleanor Finch had been a study in quiet, composed grief, her stepson was the complete antithesis. Julian stormed into the morning room with a belligerent air, his face flushed and his movements jerky. He had, I suspected, fortified himself with brandy, and the spirit had done little to improve his temper.
He did not sit, but chose to stand before the fireplace, his back to the cold hearth, as if preparing to repel boarders. "Look here," he began, without any preamble. "I don't know what you expect to get from me. I've told the inspector everything. It's a damned tragedy, that's what it is. My father, he wasn't an easy man, but he was my father." The words sounded rehearsed, a line he had been practicing in his head. Poirot regarded him with a calm, almost placid expression. "Monsieur Finch, your father did not die of natural causes. He was murdered, in a house full of people, of which you were one. It is therefore necessary that I ask you some questions." "Ask away," Julian said with a shrug, though his hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. "But if you're looking for a murderer, you should be talking to her." "Her?" Poirot's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. "My stepmother, Lady Finch." He sneered the title. "The grieving widow. Don't you find it all a bit convenient? She's the one who stood to gain everything, the one my father, in his dotage, was about to hand the entire family fortune to. And yet, with your father's death, that new will is not yet in effect, is it not?" Poirot asked mildly. "I have made the inquiries with the solicitor. As Lord Alistair died before the previous will was formally superseded, it is the old will that stands, the will in which you, Monsieur Finch, are the primary beneficiary." This was a direct hit. Julian's blustering facade crumbled for a moment, revealing a raw panic underneath. He stared at Poirot, his mouth opening and closing silently. It was a point of law I had not considered, and it turned the immediate motive completely on its head. I didn't know that," he stammered. "The lawyers. No one said." "It is a fact nonetheless," Poirot said, his voice still soft. "So you see, it is you, not Lady Finch, who benefits most immediately from your father's timely demise. You inherit the fortune that, only hours before his death, he had promised to take away from you. That is a powerful motive, is it not?" "It was my birthright," Julian exploded, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "He had no right to take it from me. It was her doing, whispering poison in his ear, turning him against his own flesh and blood." "Let us speak of the time after dinner, Monsieur Finch, after you had an unpleasant argument with your father. Where did you go?" "I went to my sitting room. I had a drink. Several drinks, if you must know. I was upset." "And you remained there for the entire evening?" "Yes. My wife, Penelope, was with me for some of it. Then she went to her room to get ready for bed. I stayed. Paced about a bit. Had another brandy." "You did not, perhaps, feel the need to speak with your father, to try and reason with him?" "Reason with my father? You didn't know him. He was like granite. Once his mind was made up, that was it. There would have been no point. I knew it was over." "So you sat, and you drank, and you did not leave the room until you heard Lady Finch scream at 11 o'clock. "That's right." His answer was a little too quick, a little too defiant. Poirot fell silent. He picked an imaginary piece of lint from his sleeve, a gesture I knew meant his mind was working at furious speed. "Monsieur Finch," he said, changing tact completely, "you served in the army, I believe, in Africa." Julian looked startled. "Yes, years ago. The King's African Rifles. What's that got to do with anything?" "You were stationed in Kenya, were you not? A country where the boomslang is native." The air in the room suddenly felt very cold. Julian stared at Poirot, his bravado gone, replaced with a look of genuine fear. "I was a soldier, not a bloody zookeeper. I wouldn't know a boomslang from a garden worm. This is absurd." "Is it?" Poirot pressed. "You are a man in desperate financial straits. Your father is about to disinherit you. You have knowledge of the very country from which this impossibly rare poison originates. And you had, by your own admission, A furious argument with him on the night he was killed. It's a setup, he insisted. It's she that's trying to frame me. The snake venom, it's all so theatrical. It's meant to point to me, to my past. She's clever, I'll give her that. The quiet little nurse, playing the long game. That will be all for now, Monsieur Finch, Poirot said dismissively. Julian looked as though he wanted to say more, to argue, to protest his innocence with more force. But something in Poirot's cool, unwavering gaze seemed to defeat him. He turned and left the room, slamming the door behind him. "Well," I said, breaking the silence, "he's certainly the most likely suspect. Motive, opportunity, and a connection, however tenuous, to the poison. He's practically confessing." "Is he, Hastings?" Poirot murmured, his eyes on the door. "Or is he merely the most obvious? The two are not always the same. Send in his wife, if you please. Let us see if her story is the same as his." Penelope Finch was a different proposition altogether. Where her husband was all bluster and emotion, she was cold, precise, and controlled. She sat in the chair Eleanor had occupied, her back straight, her hands resting calmly on her lap. She looked Poirot directly in the eye, a silent challenge. "Mrs. Finch," Poirot began, "your husband has told me that after the unpleasantness at dinner, you both retired to your sitting room." "That is correct," she said, her voice crisp. "Julian was, as you can imagine, extremely overwrought. I felt it my duty to try and calm him." "And did you succeed?" A faint, contemptuous smile touched her lips. "Calming Julian when he's in one of his states is like trying to calm a typhoon. He drank a great deal of brandy and raged about the injustice of it all. It was all rather tiresome." "You were with him for the entire evening?" Here she paused, just for a second, but it was a pause freighted with significance. "Not the entire evening, no. At around 10 o'clock, I developed something of a headache. All the shouting. I went to our bedroom to lie down and read." "So your husband was alone from 10 o'clock until 11? "Yes, he was still in the sitting room, with his brandy, when I left." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Your husband did not mention this. He implied you were with him until you went to bed." "My husband," she said, with a delicate but dismissive shrug, "is not always precise with details, especially when he has been drinking. I assure you, I left him at 10. "I see. And you, Mrs. Finch, what is your opinion of this new will?" "It was a catastrophe," she said, with sudden, surprising venom. "Alistair was an old man. He was besotted with that woman. She played on his fears, his weakness. She isolated him from his family and convinced him to throw away his son's birthright. It was a travesty." "So you were as angry as your husband?" "I was angry, Monsieur Poirot, but I am also a pragmatist. I knew that shouting and breaking things would solve nothing. I was already considering our legal options, contesting the will on the grounds of undue influence. A lengthy and expensive process, is it not?" "Indeed, but preferable to penury." Poirot leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Mrs. Finch, I must ask you the same question I asked Lady Finch. The poison, the venom of an African snake. Does this mean anything to you?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Only that it is a very dramatic, almost literary way to kill someone, and that it seems designed to cast suspicion on my husband, given his military history. It is, as I believe he probably told you, far too convenient." "Your composure is absolute. You have corroborated the most damaging part of the timeline, the hour Julian was left alone, while simultaneously reinforcing his own theory that he was being framed. She was, I realized, a far more intelligent and formidable player than her husband. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. You may go." She rose, gave a slight nod, and exited as coolly as she had entered. "By Jove, Poirot," I exclaimed, once she was gone. "She's a cool customer. She's just handed us her husband's opportunity on a silver platter." "Precisely, Hastings," Poirot said, a thoughtful frown on his face. "She has done so, and the question we must ask ourselves is why."
Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. Poirot's question hung in the air between us, as chilling as the damp that seemed to seep through the very stones of Somerton Court. Why would a wife so calmly provide the evidence that could hang her own husband? Was it a simple, callous disregard for his fate, or was it part of a more complex, more subtle game? "Perhaps they are in it together," I ventured. "She provides him with an alibi that is deliberately flawed, so that when it is broken the police look no further than him, assuming the case is solved. It leaves her in the clear." "A possibility, Hastings, a definite possibility," Poirot conceded, though he did not seem entirely convinced. "It presupposes a level of criminal genius in Mr. Finch that, I must confess, I do not yet perceive. His passions are too near the surface. He is a creature of impulse, not of cunning. But the wife, Madame Penelope, she is another matter entirely." He stood and began to pace the small room, his patent leather shoes making no sound on the thick rug. "No, we must continue to gather the facts. Let us hear from the dragon of the house, the keeper of the flame. Send for Miss Thorne." Elspeth Thorne entered the morning room not as a suspect summoned for questioning, but as a queen entering her court. Her back was so straight it seemed to curve backwards, and her face was set in an expression of permanent, righteous disapproval. She did not wait to be invited to sit, but lowered herself into the chair with the stiff, deliberate motion of an ancient automaton. "I suppose you wish to ask me questions, just as that flat-footed inspector did," she began, her voice a dry rustle. "It is a waste of time. I know who is responsible for this." Poirot, who had resumed his seat, leaned forward with interest. "Indeed, mademoiselle, then you will save us all a great deal of trouble." "It is as plain as the nose on your face," she declared, her gaze unwavering. "That woman, the so-called Lady Finch, she has done this. From the moment she arrived, she has been working to this end, to supplant the memory of my dear, sainted Margaret, the first Lady Finch, and to seize the family's fortune for herself." "You make a serious accusation, Miss Thorne," Poirot said, his tone grave. "On what do you base it?" "I base it on my eyes and my ears and the good sense God gave me," she retorted. "I saw the way she looked at him, not with love but with assessment, the way a butcher looks at a prize pig. She charmed him, she flattered his vanity. An old man is a foolish creature, Monsieur Poirot, and Lord Alistair, for all his strength, was a very foolish creature where she was concerned. He was blind to her ambition." "And on the night of his death, what did you observe?" "I observed her performance at the dinner table, the feigned shock at his announcement, the pretty, innocent act. It was sickening. After he left the room and that disgraceful scene with Julian throwing the glass, I retired to my own chambers. I could not bear to be in the same room as any of them a moment longer." "What time was this?" "It would have been shortly after 9:30. "And you did not leave your room again?" "I did not. I have my routine. I read a chapter of the Bible, I say my prayers, and I am in bed by 10:30. I heard nothing until the screaming started." "Miss Thorne, you have been in this house for a long time. You knew its master better than anyone. Tell me about his study. It was his sanctuary, was it not?" A flicker of something softer, a hint of genuine grief, passed across the old woman's severe features. "It was. No one entered without his express permission. He spent most of his days in there, managing his affairs, reading his histories. Everything had its place. He could not abide disorder."
"Disorder," Poirot pounced on the word. "I mean untidiness," she clarified, with a touch of impatience. He was a man of immense routine. Every evening before retiring he would tidy his desk, the papers squared, the pens in their tray, the inkwell capped. The last thing he would do every single night was take up his silver letter opener, a gift from his first wife, and slit open the Evening Post, which Jennings would have left for him. He would read his letters, and only then would he turn off the lamp and go to bed. He did this every night for 30 years I knew him. Poirot's eyes were gleaming with a strange intensity. "Every night, you say, without fail." "Without fail," she confirmed. He was a creature of habit. "And on the desk, when he was found, the letter opener, it was there?" "Of course it was there, lying beside the ledger, just as the police photographs show." "But the Evening Post, Miss Thorne, was that there also?" She frowned, thinking back. "No, I do not believe it was. I saw the desk after the police arrived. There were no letters, only the ledger and the other items." "How very interesting," Poirot murmured, almost to himself. He stood and gave a small, formal bow. "Thank you, mademoiselle. You have been of the most invaluable assistance." Miss Thorne looked slightly taken aback, as if she could not quite comprehend how her testimony could be considered helpful to an investigation she believed should be focused solely on Eleanor. She gave a stiff nod and departed. "Poirot, what is it?" I asked eagerly, leaning forward. "The letter opener? The post? What does it mean?" "It means, my dear Hastings, that we have found our first true inconsistency, our first note that is out of tune in this symphony of lies." He was buzzing with a renewed energy. "Lord Alistair is a man of unbreakable routine. Every night he opens his post with that specific letter opener, yet on the night he is murdered, the letter opener is on the desk, but the post is not. Why? What does this tell us?" I confessed it told me very little. Perhaps Jennings forgot to bring it. "A man like Jennings does not forget," Poirot said dismissively. "No, there is another explanation. But first we must speak to the good doctor. There is a question I neglected to ask him." Dr. Arbuthnot was summoned. He entered with his usual air of quiet professionalism. His face ached with concern. "Doctor," Poirot began, dispensing with pleasantries, "a small question of medical detail. The poison, the boomslang venom. You said it was fast-acting. How fast, precisely?" The doctor considered. "Extremely. In a man of Lord Alistair's age and fragile condition, I should say unconsciousness would be a matter of seconds. Death would follow in under a minute. It is a terrifyingly efficient substance." "So there would be no time to cry out, no time to struggle?" "None whatsoever," the doctor confirmed. "It would be as if a switch had been flicked. One moment he would be sitting there, the next he would be gone." "And the method of delivery," Poirot continued, his voice low and deliberate. "We have assumed a needle, a hypodermic syringe, perhaps." "It is the most likely explanation, yes. But a syringe, it is a clumsy object, is it not? One must uncap it, insert it, depress the plunger. A man, even an old man, might see it and react, might not he, even if only for a second?" "It's possible," the doctor conceded. "It would have to be done very quickly, by surprise." Poirot's eyes strayed to the window, a far-off look in them. But what if there was another way? A way to deliver the poison that was more elegant, more subtle, an object that the victim might not even see until it was too late. He turned his gaze back to the doctor, his green eyes shining like a cat's in the dimming light. "Tell me, doctor, the silver letter opener on the desk, the police examined it, of course?" "Yes, thoroughly," the doctor said, looking puzzled. "For fingerprints, traces of blood, there was nothing." "Ah," said Poirot softly, "but did they look for a tiny, hollow point? Did they look for a mechanism of injection within the object itself?" The doctor stared at him, his mouth falling open in astonishment. The implication was as brilliant as it was horrifying. A murder weapon hidden in plain sight, an object so familiar that no one would ever think to look at it twice. "My God," the doctor whispered, "is that even possible?" "In this world, my friend," Poirot said, his voice grim, "anything is possible when the human heart is filled with a desire to kill."
Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. Poirot's electrifying suggestion sent a ripple of activity through the stagnant investigation. Inspector Davies, his initial skepticism of the little Belgian now thoroughly replaced by a grudging respect, immediately had the silver letter opener packaged and sent under guard to a specialist at Scotland Yard, an expert in unusual mechanisms and weaponry. The house, meanwhile, was placed under a state of quiet siege, with no one permitted to leave. The inhabitants of Somerton Court were now prisoners, trapped not only by the incessant rain, but by the invisible walls of Poirot's inquiry. While we awaited the report from London, a process that would take at least a day, Poirot declared that he wished to exorcise the little grey cells with a change of scenery. This change of scenery, to my surprise, consisted of a slow, meticulous tour of the ground-floor rooms, beginning with the vast, chilly ballroom that had not been used in decades. "What are we looking for, Poirot?" I asked, as he ran a gloved finger over a dusty grand piano. "We are not looking, Hastings. We are feeling. We are absorbing the atmosphere of this house. It is a sad place, is it not? Full of the ghosts of past glories and the bitter taste of present resentments. A murder does not happen in a vacuum. It is the culmination of 1,000 small unhappinesses." His tour seemed aimless. He commented on the fading tapestries, the quality of the wood paneling, the draught from a particular window. But I knew him well enough to understand that his mind was constantly working, arranging the facts, searching for the single thread that would unravel the whole tangled mess. "Everyone lies, Hastings," he said suddenly, stopping to stare at a portrait of a stern-looking Finch ancestor. "That is the one constant in a case of this nature. Lady Finch lies about her ambition. Mr. Finch lies about his alibi. Mrs. Finch lies about her loyalty to her husband. Miss Thorne lies about the purity of her devotion. It is mixed, I think, with a great deal of pride and jealousy. They all have their secrets." "But surely one of them is the murderer," I insisted. "Oh yes, one of them is the murderer. But the secrets of the others, they are the fog that obscures the path to the truth. We must blow away this fog. We need a fact, a simple, verifiable fact that someone has tried to conceal." It was with this mission in mind that he requested a quiet word with Jennings, the butler. We found the old man in his pantry, polishing silver with the slow, methodical movements of one who has performed the same task for half a century. He was a tall, skeletal figure, and his face, a mask of professional impassivity, gave nothing away. "Jennings," Poirot began, his tone friendly and conversational, "you have been with this family for a long time." 52 years, sir," the butler replied, his voice a low, respectful monotone. "I came here as a footman under the old lord, Lord Alistair's father." "Then you have seen many things.
You know the rhythms of this house better than anyone. Tell me, in the week leading up to Lord Alistair's death, was there anything unusual? Any deviation from the normal routine?" Jennings paused in his polishing, his eyes distant. "Unusual, sir? Things have been, well, tense for many months, since the master's health took a turn for the worse. Mr. Julian has been more frequently in his cups. Mrs. Penelope has been short-tempered with the staff, but that is not perhaps what you mean. I mean visitors, Jennings, strangers, deliveries, anything out of the ordinary." The butler hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Yes, Jennings, there was something?" "It is perhaps nothing, sir. It is not my place to comment on the affairs of the family. In a murder investigation, Jennings, everything is your place. The police could compel you to speak. I merely ask you for your cooperation." The old man sighed, a faint, weary sound. He set down his polishing cloth. "2 days before his lordship's death, on the Tuesday, a motor car arrived in the afternoon, a gentleman I did not recognize. He asked for Mrs. Finch, Mrs. Julian Finch." "Penelope?" I exclaimed. "Indeed, sir," Jennings confirmed. "She had instructed me that she was not to be disturbed that afternoon, as she was suffering from a migraine. But when I informed the gentleman of this, he was most insistent. He gave me his card. He said Mrs. Finch was expecting him." "And you have this card?" Poirot asked, his voice taut with excitement. "I do, sir." Jennings retrieved a small silver salver from a drawer and produced a single crisp white card from under a linen cloth. Poirot took it, holding it delicately by the edges. The card was embossed with the name of a prestigious London law firm. In the corner, a name was elegantly printed, Mr. Jonathan Shaw. "And Mrs. Finch met with this Mr. Shaw?" Poirot asked, his voice tight with excitement. "Yes, sir, in the small parlour, for nearly an hour. The gentleman seemed most agitated when he left, and Mrs. Finch, when I saw her later, her migraine seemed to have passed, but her eyes were very red, as if she had been crying." "And she did not mention this visitor to the police or to me?" "Not to my knowledge, sir." "Thank you, Jennings. You have been most helpful," Poirot said, pocketing the card. As we left the pantry, my mind was racing. A secret meeting with a lawyer. Poirot, what can it mean? Was she planning to divorce Julian? To sue the old man? "It means, Hastings, that we have found our first deliberate, calculated lie of omission. Penelope Finch, the cool pragmatist, has a secret that was important enough to lie about and emotional enough to make her weep. And secrets, my friend, are the breeding ground of murder." He patted his pocket where the solicitor's card now rested. "First we had the inconsistency of the letter opener. Now we have the hidden visitor. The threads, Hastings, they are beginning to appear. We must pull on them, gently at first, and then snap." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a breathless police constable, who hurried towards us holding a telegram. "For you, sir, from Inspector Davies. It's a message from the yard." Poirot took the telegram and slit it open with his thumb. He read the short message, and a small, grim smile touched his lips. He handed it to me. The message was brief and to the point. "Letter opener examined. Stop intricate spring-loaded mechanism found in hilt. Stop hollow needlepoint detected. Stop traces of unidentified alkaloid residue present.
Stop proceeding with caution. Weapon is lethal. I looked up at Poirot, my blood running cold. My God, Poirot, you were right. But of course I was right, he said, with a flash of his old arrogance. But there was no triumph in his eyes, only a cold, hard certainty. The picture becomes clearer. We have a murder weapon of extraordinary cunning, and we have a house full of people with secrets. Now the real work begins.
Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. Armed with the telegram from Scotland Yard and the solicitor's business card, Poirot was no longer the patient observer. A new, almost predatory energy radiated from him. He was a hunter who had found the trail, and he intended to follow it to its source. "We will now speak again with Mrs. Penelope Finch," he announced to Inspector Davies. "But this time it will not be a conversation. It will be an application of pressure, a small, precise application to see where the cracks appear." Penelope was summoned once more to the chilly morning room. If she was surprised by the summons, she did not show it. She entered with the same icy composure as before, her expression a mask of polite inquiry. She sat, smoothed her skirt, and waited, her eyes fixed on Poirot. Poirot did not begin with a question. Instead, he placed two items on the small table between them. The first was the telegram. The second was the solicitor's business card. He laid them side by side with the deliberate precision of a jeweler arranging gems on a velvet cloth. Penelope's eyes flickered down to the items. Her gaze rested on the telegram for a moment, uncomprehending. But when she saw the business card, a subtle, almost imperceptible change occurred. The color drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of parchment. Her hands, which had been resting so calmly in her lap, clenched into fists. The mask of control was still there, but it had become brittle, fragile. "The science of detection, it is a marvelous thing, is it not, madame? The experts in London, they have confirmed my little theory. The letter opener was not a letter opener at all. It was a weapon, an ingenious and silent weapon, capable of delivering a fatal dose of poison in an instant." He paused, letting the word sink in. "A poison, I might add, that is so rare it points almost directly to your husband and his time in Africa. It is a very neat and tidy case that someone has arranged for the police, no?" Penelope said nothing. Her jaw was tight, her breathing shallow. "But then," Poirot continued, tapping a manicured finger on the white business card, "there are the little details that do not fit into this neat picture. A secret visitor, for example, a solicitor from London, a Mr. Jonathan Shaw, a man you met with in secret only 2 days before your father-in-law was murdered, a meeting you failed to mention to the police, a meeting that, according to the butler, left you in tears. That does not seem the action of a cool pragmatist, Mrs. Finch. It seems the action of a woman in very great distress." The silence stretched, taut and vibrating. For a long moment I thought she would not break. She stared at Poirot, her eyes blazing with a mixture of fear and defiance. But the pressure was too great. The carefully constructed walls of her composure began to crumble. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, then another. Her shoulders began to shake, and she covered her face with her hands, her body racked with silent, convulsive sobs. The emotional turning point had arrived. Poirot waited patiently. He did not press her, did not offer a word of comfort. He simply waited for the storm to pass. After a few minutes, her sobs subsided into ragged gasps. She fumbled in her handbag for a handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes, her movements clumsy. Her icy control
utterly shattered. "You must tell me the truth, madame," Poirot said, his voice still quiet, but now with an edge of steel. "It was Julian," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "It was always Julian. His debts, they were worse than you can possibly imagine, worse than even I knew." "Go on," Poirot urged. She took a shuddering breath. "He owed money to some very dangerous people, loan sharks, men who do not listen to excuses. They were threatening him, threatening us. A few months ago, in a moment of sheer, idiotic panic, he did something unforgivable." She looked up, her eyes pleading. "He had access to his father's business papers. He forged his father's signature on a letter of credit for a very large sum of money. He thought he could win it all back at the races, pay it off before anyone noticed. But of course, he lost everything." I glanced at Poirot. His expression was intense, his entire being focused on her confession. "The man Julian had borrowed from discovered the forgery. He went to his own solicitors. That was Mr. Shaw. He came here not to see me about a divorce, but to deliver an ultimatum. Either the money was repaid in full within 1 week, or he would go to Lord Alistar with proof of the forgery, and then he would go to the police." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. This was not just about disinheritance. It was about ruin, a criminal prosecution, prison, the utter destruction of the Finch name. "We were trapped," she wept. "If Alistar found out, he would not have paid. He would have let Julian go to prison to teach him a lesson. It would have been the ultimate disgrace. I begged Mr. Shaw for more time, but he was adamant. The deadline was the end of the week." "And the night of the murder was the night before that deadline expired," Poirot said. She nodded miserably. "When Alistar made his announcement about the will, it was the final straw. It wasn't just that we were being cut off. It was that our last desperate hope of finding the money to pay Mr. Shaw was gone. We were finished." "So, your husband, in his desperation, went to his father's study," I began, but Penelope cut me off, her head snapping up. "No," she cried, with a flash of her old fire. "Julian was distraught. He was drunk. He was talking wildly about running away, about ending it all. But he's not a killer, Monsieur Poirot. He is weak and foolish, but he's not evil. He did not kill his father." "And yet, madame," Poirot said, his gaze piercing, "you lied for him. You gave him a false alibi, and then you deliberately broke it yourself, leaving him alone for that crucial hour between 10 and 11. Why would you do that, if not to cast suspicion upon him?" Her face crumpled again. "Because I was afraid," she cried. "When I heard Eleanor scream, my first thought was that Julian, in his drunken despair, had gone to confront his father, and that something terrible had happened. An accident, a fight. I didn't know it was murder then. I thought it was a heart attack. I wanted to protect him, to give him time, so I said I was with him. But when I found out it was murder, when I heard about the poison, I knew he couldn't have done it. It's not his way. It's too clever, too quiet. So I told the truth. I told you he was alone because I knew he was innocent, and I thought the truth would help you find the real killer." It was a tangled, desperate explanation, a mixture of lies and partial truths, all born of panic. "And who, in your opinion, is the real killer?" Poirot asked softly. Her eyes narrowed, and the tears were replaced by a look of pure venom. "Her," she hissed, "Eleanor. She knew about Julian's debts. Alistar told her everything. She knew we were desperate.
She knew about Julian's time in Africa. She planted the idea of the poison. She killed him, knowing that Julian would be the perfect scapegoat. She gets the fortune, and she gets rid of the son she despises in one single brilliant stroke. Don't you see? She's the serpent. She has been all along.
Chapter 9. The Trap. Penelope's final, venomous accusation hung in the air like poison itself. She had cracked, as Poirot had predicted, and in so doing had laid bare the true, desperate motive that lay beneath the surface of the family's greed. Not just the loss of an inheritance, but the imminent threat of prison and total social ruin. Yet in her confession, she had only pointed the finger of blame more fiercely at another. Poirot let her leave the room, a broken and weeping figure, a world away from the icy woman who had entered. He watched her go, his expression thoughtful, almost melancholy. "The truth, Hastings, is a bitter medicine. She has told us a great deal, but has she told us all?" "It seems to fit, Poirot," I argued. "Eleanor knew about the forgery. She knew Julian was the perfect suspect. She kills the old man, frames the son, and walks away with everything. It's diabolical." "It is a theory," Poirot corrected me gently. "A very plausible theory. But it is not yet a fact. We have the why, the great pressure of the forgery. We have the how, the ingenious letter opener. But we do not yet have the who. Not for certain. And so tonight we must set a little trap." His eyes took on that familiar cat-like gleam that I knew so well. "Tonight, Hastings, we will give our killer a chance to expose himself, or indeed, herself." That evening, at Poirot's request, the entire household was assembled in the library. This was a room designed to intimidate, lined from floor to ceiling with the collected knowledge and history of the Finch dynasty. A massive fire roared in the hearth, casting flickering shadows that made the faces of the assembled parties seem like grotesque masks of anxiety. They sat in a semicircle of chairs, facing Poirot, who stood before the fireplace like a priest before his congregation. I stood to one side, with Inspector Davies and Dr. Arbuthnot near the door, a silent and imposing presence. The suspects were a study in contained panic. Julian Finch was pale and trembling, his eyes darting nervously from his wife to Poirot. Penelope, her face swollen from crying, stared at the floor, the picture of shame and misery. Miss Thorne sat as rigid as ever, but her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. And Eleanor, the black-clad widow, watched Poirot with a look of intense, fearful concentration, her composure a thin and fragile veneer. Poirot began, his voice calm and measured, filling the silent room. "We are gathered here because a man has been murdered. But this was not a crime of passion. It was not a blow struck in anger. It was a crime of immense cunning, of careful planning, and of a truly cold heart. It was a crime that required a very particular set of knowledge." He paused, his eyes moving slowly from one face to another. "It required, for instance, the knowledge that Mr. Julian Finch was on the verge of a terrible scandal involving forgery, a scandal that would not only ruin him, but would bring disgrace upon the entire family. A secret known only to Mr. and Mrs. Finch, and to the man who confided in his wife completely, Lord Alistair." He glanced at Eleanor, who flinched as if struck. "It required," he continued, "the knowledge of a rare and terrible poison from a specific part of Africa, a place that immediately brings to mind Mr. Finch's military service. A clever piece of misdirection, that."
and it required the knowledge of Lord Alistair's most rigid and unshakable habit, the habit of opening his evening post every night with a particular silver letter opener. He allowed a moment for this to sink in before he delivered the first blow. A letter opener that was, in fact, a marvel of engineering, a weapon designed to kill with a single silent touch. He held up the telegram from Scotland Yard. Our friends at the Yard were most impressed. A spring-loaded needle, a tiny reservoir for poison, a masterpiece of its kind. A collective gasp went through the room. Julian stared, open-mouthed, while Miss Thorne's hand flew to her chest. "But a mechanism so fine," Poirot went on, his eyes now scanning their faces intently, "requires a very specific lubricant to keep it in working order. A special, fine-grade clock oil, to be precise, an oil that is not commonly found. And the police, in their methodical way, have been searching for the container of this oil. They did not find it in Mr. Julian's rooms. They did not find it in Lady Finch's rooms." He was laying the trap now, baiting it with a lie. I knew the police had found no such thing, but he delivered the line with such absolute conviction that it felt like gospel truth. "But there are many places in a house this size to hide such a small thing. Emused a manissa polat to hecors of a tweth. In a sewing box, perhaps? Or a medical bag? Or even—" He let his gaze drift towards the great roll-top desk in the corner of the library, "in a dusty old desk drawer, forgotten for years." He then turned his attention to Dr. Arbuthnot. "Doctor, you have been most helpful, but there is one final service you may render. You knew the deceased's constitution better than anyone. The poison, we know, was swift. But tell me, would there have been any post-mortem effects? Any small reaction that only a trained medical eye might see?" Dr. Arbuthnot, playing his part in the charade, frowned thoughtfully. "It's possible," he said slowly. "The venom is a hemotoxin. It's conceivable it might react strangely with the chemicals in, say, the ink of a freshly signed document. A slight, almost invisible discoloration, perhaps. One would need a magnifying glass to see it." "Precisely," Poirot exclaimed, as if this was the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. "The new will! Lord Alistair had it brought to him that afternoon. He was to have signed it that very evening. Inspector, we must examine that document at once. If the signature is discolored, it will prove he was poisoned after he had signed it. If it is clear, it proves he was killed before he could make the new will official." It was a masterful stroke of psychological theater. He had linked the murder directly to the timing of the will's signature, creating a moment of unbearable tension. The fate of the entire Finch fortune now seemed to hang on a smudge of ink. Inspector Davies nodded grimly and started towards the desk where a locked document box, retrieved from the solicitor, had been placed earlier. And in that moment, the trap was sprung. It was not a loud reaction. It was almost imperceptible, a tiny, involuntary movement that I would have missed entirely had I not been watching so closely. But Poirot, of course, missed nothing. As the inspector reached for the box, Miss Thorne, the rigid, unshakable guardian of the Finch legacy, made a small choked sound in the back of her throat. Her body, for the first time, lost its rigid posture, and she slumped forward in her chair, her hand instinctively moving towards her handbag on the floor beside her. It was the gesture of a person reaching for something they desperately needed, or something they desperately wished to ensure was still there. Poirot's eyes, bright and hard as emeralds, locked onto her. The rest of the room, the drama of the will, the fate of the Finches, all of it faded into the background. He had seen what he needed to see. The serpent had stirred.
Chapter 10. The Reveal. Poirot raised a hand, and Inspector Davies, halfway to the desk, stopped in his tracks. The dramatic tension of the unsigned will evaporated, replaced by a new, more focused intensity. Every eye in the room, which had been fixed on the document box, now followed Poirot's gaze to the slumped figure of Elspeth Thorne. "That will not be necessary, Inspector," Poirot said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the library. "The will is of no consequence. Lord Alistair never had any intention of signing it that night. It was merely a tool, a cruel instrument of torture he was using to torment his family. No, the truth of this matter does not lie in a document. It lies in the heart." He took a step forward, his attention solely fixed on the elderly companion. "It lies in a heart filled with a love so fierce, so possessive, that it became twisted into something dark and terrible. A love for the past. A love for a memory." Miss Thorne looked up, her face a mask of confusion and fear. I don't know what you mean." "I think you do, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently. "Let us put aside the obvious suspects, shall we? Mr. Finch, he had the motive of desperation, yes, but he is not a man of subtlety. He breaks glasses when he is angry. He does not build intricate murder weapons. And Lady Finch, she had the motive of greed, perhaps, but she is a nurse. She is trained to save life, not to take it. And she was, I believe, genuinely shocked by her husband's announcement. No, the key to this crime is not in the new motives that were created that night, but in a very, very old one." Chapter 11. The Reflection. The departure of Miss Thorne in the custody of Inspector Davies left a vacuum in the library, a profound and ringing silence that was deeper than any that had come before. The fire in the hearth, which had seemed so menacing during the confrontation, now cast a gentle, almost forgiving light on the faces of the remaining few. The drama was over, the serpent defanged, and what was left was the messy, quiet wreckage of human lives. Julian Finch, the new Lord Finch, sat slumped in his chair, his head in his hands. The threat of prison had been lifted, his inheritance was secure, but he looked like a man who had won a battle only to find the prize was ashes. Penelope stood behind him, her hand resting tentatively on his shoulder, her expression a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and perhaps, for the first time in a long time, a flicker of genuine sympathy for her husband. Eleanor, the young widow, simply stared into the fire, her face pale and unreadable. The fortune she had never wanted was no longer hers to worry about, but she was alone in a house that had brought her nothing but grief. Poirot watched them for a moment, then turned to me as we stood by the window. Outside, the endless rain had finally ceased. A watery, late-afternoon sun was breaking through the clouds, its rays glinting on the wet slate of the roof and the dripping leaves of the great oaks. "It is over, mon ami," he said softly. "I still can't quite believe it, Poirot," I confessed. "Miss Thorne, all that bitterness and rage, hidden behind that starched collar for so many years. It is often the quietest waters that run the deepest, Hastings, and the most poisonous. Her love for the First Lady Finch was the central pillar of her existence. When Lord Alistair threatened to knock down that pillar by, in her eyes, replacing his first wife with the second, her entire world began to collapse. The murder was not an act of greed. It was, in her mind, an act of restoration, of setting the world back to its proper order." "But the planning," I exclaimed, "the cunning of it, the letter opener, the poison, the framing of Julian, it was the work of a master criminal." "It was the work of a master obsessive," Poirot corrected. "For 15 years, since her brother's death, she's had the means, the poison, she's had the potential weapon, the letter opener, and for years she has had the technical knowledge inherited from her father, the clockmaker. All these things lay dormant, Hastings, like a loaded gun in a drawer. It required only the pressure on the trigger. Lord Alistair's announcement was that pressure." He sighed, a small, sad sound. "She saw herself as a figure of justice, a righteous avenger. It is the most dangerous delusion of them all. She did not see that in trying to preserve a memory, she had become a monster. She became the very thing she accused Lady Finch of being, a serpent in the garden, bringing death." Dr. Arbuthnot approached us, his face weary. "I've given Lady Finch a mild sedative, and I think the new Lord Finch could do with a period of quiet reflection, away from the brandy decanter. You have done a remarkable thing here tonight, Monsieur Poirot." "I have done nothing, Doctor, but arrange the facts in their proper order," Poirot replied with a modest wave of his hand. "The facts were all here, in this house, in the inconsistencies of a routine, in a secret meeting with a solicitor, in the family history of a quiet companion. My work is merely to see the pattern that these facts create." Julian looked up as the doctor spoke. He rose unsteadily to his feet and came towards us. He looked at Poirot, his eyes red-rimmed, but clear for the first time since our arrival. I owe you my life," he stammered. "My freedom, at least. I behaved like a fool and a cad." He glanced at Eleanor. "I am sorry," he said, and it seemed he was speaking to everyone, and perhaps to the house itself. Poirot inclined his head. "The slate, it is wiped clean, Lord Finch. What you write on it now, that is for you to decide." There was a sense of a new, fragile beginning in the room. The old tyrant was gone, and the long, bitter winter of his reign was over.
What would grow in its place was uncertain, but for the first time there was a chance for something other than resentment and fear. An hour later, our bags were packed, and the Daimler was waiting in the drive, its engine humming softly in the crisp, clean air. The sun was setting, bathing the ancient stones of Somerton Court in a warm golden light that softened its harsh angles and made it look almost peaceful. As we drove away, I looked back at the great house. "Do you think they'll be all right, Poirot?" He did not turn, but kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead, as if already focused on the order and symmetry of London. "They have been given a second chance, Hastings. It is more than most of us receive. Whether they will use it wisely is a matter for their own little gray cells, not for mine." He adjusted the small vase of flowers on the dashboard, ensuring it was perfectly centered. "The passions of the heart, they are a messy and illogical business. They lead to the breaking of the 10 Commandments and the disruption of the beautiful order. We have restored the order, mon ami, and for Hercule Poirot, that is enough." The car picked up speed, leaving Somerton Court and its ghosts behind us, shrinking in the twilight. The case was closed.